Hi, my name's Steve Larder. I'm the artist of issue 11 of the Dawn of the Unread series entitled Books and Bowstrings. My interest in sort of comics and zines was largely sparked through DIY punk. Sort of throughout my teens, my previous experience of like comics was like a really limited view of like Marvel superheroes and things like that. And whilst I totally recognised the sort of influence and importance of that side of sort of comic culture, it's never been a genre I've been particularly keen on, and I've never been able to sort of relate to it at all. So basically, during my teens, I started to discover the sort of the local DIY punk scene, and I was as a result I was introduced to the idea of zines, and I suppose I'm fortunate that I was introduced to some really good ones, like this one, which is called Gadgie, which was written by a friend of mine called Marv, and basically it's just it's a long-running sort of punk fanzine, which it's just funny, personal, and kind of reads more like a journal than, you know, sort of like a typical glossy music magazine, and I found that really appealing. Around the same sort of period, I was introduced to comics by artists like Jonan Vasquez, who wrote this one, Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, and like seeing this was like another sort of like light bulb moment for me. I just loved the stark sort of black and white artwork, and it just didn't occur to me at all that comics could be approached in this sort of way. I mean, the subject matter seemed to be the sort of thing that you find doodled in the margins of like school textbooks and diary entries, which really sort of like opened doors for me in terms of how comics could be approached. I gradually became interested through that into like Indian autobiographical comics and zines, which seems more attuned to sort of like my interest in DIY punk culture. Yeah, so Rum Lad is my autobiographical comic zine, which I put out kind of wheneverly, really. Depending on the size of the issue and the funding and or the subject matter, it can take anything from like a year to a few weeks to complete an issue. My last issue was a split with the aforementioned Gadgie fanzine, where like I did one side and Marv did the other side, and in this one I sort of talk about discovering the local punk scene on my doorstep and like more reflections on growing up and sort of leaving your hometown sort of thing. And throughout the whole thing I kind of illustrate it with, you know, sort of reportage style drawings and things like that. And prior to that, the issue before that, sorry, was like an illustrated journal of when I travelled around America in 2010, and in a way it was kind of like I treated it as a journal again, because, you know, it was almost beneficial for me to do it, because I would have forgotten all this stuff otherwise. So whilst I was travelling, I kept a diary and a sketchbook, and like just pretty much every day made notes and took photographs, and then when I got home I spent about a year just putting this thing together and printing it and trying to distribute it and flog it, basically. Rum Lad was my sort of first attempt at my own zine, but it took a couple of issues before it really sort of developed any sort of structure. I was inspired to contribute something back into a punk scene which I'd gotten so much out of, like ethically and sort of socially. I just liked the idea of being like in an active part of a community that where there was less focus on boundaries like things that separate consumer and creator, and more to do with like just being in a sort of supportive network. I mean, if it weren't for making zines and playing in bands and doing comics and stuff, I wouldn't have been able to do a lot of things I'd have previously thought possible, and I've got a lot to be grateful for, really, in that respect. Yeah, so this is my working area, which is just a spare room in my house. I would like to have a studio, but at the moment this is just fine. There's not really a lot to show, it's not that exciting, but I'll do my best. Basically I try and keep my sort of drawing tools fairly sort of modest. I mean, to get sort of as specific as possible, and like it's pretty dull, but hopefully somebody will find it fairly interesting. The type of paper I generally do my drawings on is this stuff, like Strathmore Bristol board. It's quite smooth, and it's really good for sort of like ink work, because it's got, you know, just no tooth to the paper at all, so I can get some like really nice lines on it, like Winsor & Newton ink, or Dr. P.H. Martin's Indian ink. If I'm using colour, I'll generally sort of do something on the Bristol board, the line work, and then photocopy onto watercolour paper, and then just sort of go over it with watercolour on that. I have gone straight onto watercolour paper before with the line work, but I've found that I'm more nervous of messing it up, because if I do, I've got to basically start the whole thing again. Most of these materials can be bought in your local art shop. They're not particularly hard to come by, and most important to me, they're sort of cheap and easy to replace if something breaks, which is like really important. I mean, like I mostly use for my line work, I use a fairly sort of straightforward like synthetic brush, and then like I've got a sable one as well, and I don't use pens a lot. Occasionally they're quite useful, again because they're cheap. I use a 0.5 lead H or HB lead mechanical pencil, because they're quite sturdy, they do the job. And I used to use a nib a lot more than what I do now, but I found I can get a much smoother and more sort of fluid line using a brush. But I still use this a lot for lettering. I quite like it, it's good stuff. And a couple of years ago I came to acquire a drawing board, which I now couldn't live without. It's absolutely essential for me. I think a lot of artists probably suffer from bad backs as a result of just being in an awkward posture for like, you know, 10 hours a day or something stupid, and like it just makes my life a lot easier to be able to sort of work in this way. And as far as like the sort of method I use, I try and keep my sort of work process as like tangible as possible. So, you know, I'm much better at working out whether something works like on paper or by mixing something myself than mucking about on Photoshop and stuff like that. I find I can sort of make better decisions in terms of like layout and you know, stuff like that, if I can actually sort of physically move it around myself. I mean, obviously this makes things a lot more like labour intensive sometimes, but you know, it just works for me, and it's not putting down anyone who does do sort of like largely digital work. Like, you know, I'm just personally not great at it, so I kind of do what works best for me. If I've spent hours on something and I ruin it at the last minute, there have been times where I've thought, you know, I wish there was like an undo button that I could sort of like, you know, erase that sort of one fatal mistake, but, you know, apparently I haven't learned my lesson because I'm still doing it. the final part of the process is once I've got the ink drawing all done up and everything, I scan it in, use like an old version of Photoshop to just sort of use it in a really rudimentary way of like cleaning up the scans and then like upping the contrast and the brightness, and then that's it. I was sent the script by James, written by Alan Gibbons, and I read it through. It was really good, really like informative, and told me everything that I needed to know. So I was really satisfied with that, and you know, just sort of check out the character notes and things like that of, you know, sort of characteristics that I need to sort of pay attention to. Like it explains that Geoffrey Trease, who is one of the main characters in this comic, like has like quite a classic sort of 1930s style haircut, so I have to obviously sort of look that thing up, and you know, just things like that, just to make sure that I'm honouring the script. So I look through that and then start doing a bit of research, and like actual images of trees was actually quite tricky to find. Like I only found 2 like photographs of him, which and there was another one of him, but it was when he was much older, so it was like I had to really decide which period I was going to use. So I decided to sort of like stick to his sort of like how he looked in the sort of like 1930s kind of style. So when I did that, the first thing I did was like my initial sketches were just sort of like trying to like find a way of drawing him which sort of felt like not so much just sort of like copying a photograph, but like finding characteristics in his face and things like that which I could sort of like easily reproduce, but also like represented him. Like that's the sort of thing I wanted to aim for. So like usually when I get something like this, I spend a long time just trying to get to grips with like the absolute basic essentials like facial expressions and things like that. So I spent quite a long time just sort of like just drawing just faces and expressions and like just sort of different ways I could like approach certain points in the story. After that first step, I would then start to draw like rough thumbnail versions of the comic, so I could sort of figure out where I want the characters to sit, like where I want the dialogue and text to sit, just so I felt more comfortable going into the final product, like what I was doing. So I basically went through every page and like sort of drew like a rough version of each one, and like they're incredibly scrappy and like rough, and just like for anybody else to look at them, they're kind of like just really like they probably don't make any sense to anyone else other than me, because they're just like that's just nonsense. It just like that one, it's like that one's even got like a coffee ring on it. It's just sort of like just, you know, I just basically did that over and over again just to sort of like you know, lay things out so I knew what I was doing when I came to ink the final drawing. I'd never actually heard of Geoffrey Trease or read his book Bows Against the Barons, which this comic which this comic is largely based on. But throughout working on this project, I've actually learned quite a lot about him. He's a pretty interesting guy. So how long the whole process takes from sort of like start to finish is basically depends on the amount of detail I'm prepared to put into the image. So, you know, like it can range from like a panel which takes like minutes to do to something that would take hours and hours and hours, and you know, it would depend on how I wanted the scene to sort of play out. Like I'm really hard on myself sometimes. Like if it's not right, if it's not exactly how I want it, it's very rare that I'll go, oh, it doesn't matter, that'll do. Like I'll be like, no, it has to be correct. So I'll sort of rub it out over and over again just so I can be satisfied with it, because I know that no matter how many times somebody will tell me like, oh, that looks fine, I'll be like, it doesn't look fine, it looks awful. So I'll do that over and over again, and even when I finish work, like, I have to put it away, because like otherwise I'll just stare at it over and over again and be like, that looks terrible, what are you doing, sort of thing. So yeah, but the whole thing, like, I'd say, you know, I basically had a few other projects and commitments to do whilst I was making this comic, but for these 8 pages that I did, it, from getting the script to submitting it last minute to James, it probably took me sort of 2 months-ish, but that was with, you know, the Christmas break and everything, so it was like, it was quite hard to fit in things like that into a sort of work schedule, I guess.